We're gonna, do our thing, talk about stuff, and let's recap for a minute. We've got time. Let's recap where we are, how we got here, and all that good stuff. Whoop, looks like the whole thing failed, and now it's back. So we'll give everybody a second to get back in because, of course, I was a knucklehead and messed with things that I shouldn't have messed with early on. Yeah, Mike's still a little quiet. I can fix that. All right, how's that? That should be more to your liking. We got all day. We're gonna get this right. Yeah, I pushed the wrong button. I'm known to do that. I like to push buttons. Sometimes I push the right ones. Sometimes I push an entire group of people's buttons, which is probably gonna start today. We're gonna push some buttons. You better believe that. So, season 4 hype. Oh, Bale, thank you for the subscription, you beautiful bastard. And yeah. So, let's just do a brief recap, shall we? How we got here. Season 1, we just, we delved into some fun stories. We learned a little bit about the law, why you have to have a parapet everywhere, for example. Season 2, we started to understand the hierarchy a little more and how the church functions. Season 3 was our salute to heresy, and we also really dove into some dogmatic and theological issues. But now, here we are, Season 4. I feel like it's really time to eat the elephant. The New Testament is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But yet, I think it's important to really understand Christianity and what it is and why it is what it is. You need to understand how it came to be. And there's a traditional narrative that I would say just about everybody knows. What I'm here to do this season is turn that narrative on its head. We are going to actually look at where that narrative came from, who that narrative benefits, and why they are so committed to continuing that narrative despite the ever-growing mountain of evidence that is not how things went. That narrative is just that. It's a narrative. It's a story. It's not the truth. And that's okay. You can believe that there's a lot of validity and good things in the Bible and still accept that the New Testament is it's a fabrication. I mean, let's just go ahead and, say it. We're not going to dance around it all season and make that pronouncement at the end of the season. It's a fabrication. Now, as if you remember, the way we ended season 3, Riffscock really plowed in there to help us understand that the books of the Old Testament were not written in the order that they are placed, and that they were placed that way to sell a specific story, not because that actually told the story that there was. It was to tell a story that was, somebody wanted to tell. So they used the documents to their advantage. Well, I hate to break it to you, and this should come as a shock to no one. The New Testament is even worse with that shit. Because while the Old Testament has a lot of books that we know weren't written by the guy whose name on them, or, I shouldn't say the guy's name on them, because those ones, for the most part, were actually written by, if you talk about your prophets, a lot of them were actually written by a guy that was likely named that. They were at least written at that time. These books in the New Testament making an entrance with DLR. Welcome to the party. Oh, man. The thing about the New Testament is not only are the books not written by who they're purported to be written by, but there has been a flat out agenda to tell you that they were. Whereas the Old Testament, like most people today, even Christians, except for like your really delusional ones. Was that so loud? Let me fix that. TLR did not write Revelation. But there's been a concerted effort to convince you that, as I was saying, the Old Testament, they know, most people, except for your most delusional of Christians, know that Moses didn't write Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Moses didn't write those books. But he's the central star, and, the books still work. The books still make sense. There's still stuff that can be gleaned from that. The New Testament, not so much, folks, because the way the New Testament works, it only works if the books were written by who they claim to be written by. And as I will show you, that's fucking impossible. Absolutely fucking impossible. There's a ridiculous narrative that is so clearly there once you look at it that I would say the entire validity of the New Testament doesn't exist. It's we will get to why they were written, but it's a lot shallower than the whole saving humanity and cluing us into a deeper truth about Jesus. That's not why they wrote these books. And it's real obvious to just about anybody who actually reads this and pays attention. But you have to pay attention. And you have to look for the details. And I think that is something that we don't do a lot of anymore, is pay attention to details. And as the old saying goes, the devil is in the details. So, let's dive in, shall we? So, you know how this works. We got the gospel according to Riff. We've been working on it for a while here. And if you remember, we called our salute to season 3. Our end of season 3 was, it seems you got these mixed up. Let me fix that for you. Well, now we're here for part 2 of I think you got these mixed up. Let me fix that for you. So, the New Testament. I would say that most people here are familiar with it, but we're going to just spend a few minutes doing a brief rundown of how is it presented to you. If you were to go grab that Bible off the shelf and open up to the New Testament, what would you encounter? Well, the first thing you would get would be 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, heralding you the story of Jesus. And sure, there's some discrepancies there. Sure, the guy, the tone of the story seems to change. Sure, there's stories that are in one that aren't in others. Apologists explain that away as 4 different guys saw the same thing happen, and they all had different takes on it. And if 4 people watch the same thing happen and retell a story, you would see the story told 4 different ways. I'm not saying that's not true. What I'm saying is that there may have been guys named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They may have followed around a guy named Jesus who happened to be from Nazareth. They didn't write those books. But, for our purposes here, sure, those are your first 4 books in your New Testament. Then you get the early post-Jesus years. At the end of the Gospels, some of them anyway, Jesus ascends into heaven, and his followers are left here. Okay, so what now? What do we do now, right? Acts. The Acts of the Apostles is the full title of that book. It gives us some insight into what was done by his followers right after he left. It's allegedly written by the guy who wrote Luke. Well, it probably was written by the guy who wrote Luke. Allegedly, it was Luke. It was not. Then we get pen pal Paul. Jesus is dead now. Paul has his conversion on the road to Damascus. We'll talk more about that next week, but I would again imagine that most of you know at least some details of that story. The Cliff Notes is Jesus appears to Paul, says, "Why are you harassing my peeps?" Paul goes, "Holy crap, you're real. I should totally tell everybody about this." And proceeds to go on a talking about Jesus tour. And he writes a lot of letters to all of his friends. Romans, 2 letters to the Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, a couple of letters to his buddy Timothy, a letter to a dude named Titus, a letter to Philemon, and the Hebrews. This is, so Paul, he takes up a bunch of space, really letting folks know what he thinks. Then, a few other people are allowed to write a letter to. You get James, who is alleged to be the brother of Jesus Christ. Peter, also known as Cephas, the Rock himself. And then John, he writes 3 very short letters. Hey Jude, he gets a book in there. And then we all know how the story ends. With the good old fashioned, who the hell put this in here? You get the nightmarish apocalypse of a guy named John who was on an isle called Patmos. And that's what he came up with. So that's how the books were presented. And it's a pretty easy to follow narrative, right? Story of Jesus, then the story of what Jesus' people do after he leaves, and then Paul writing all these liturgical books about how we're supposed to worship Jesus and making sure that he's out there converting as many non-Jews as he can to the worship of Christ, and kind of setting up how they run their churches. Then a few other people chime in brief books, and for the most part support Paul's vision. And then a big crazy apocalypse tells you how the world's going to end. It's a narrative flow that makes sense to everyone involved. If there's one thing here, you know that we have to see if it measures up. How would it measure up? What would we measure it against? Riff's cock, of course. So let's whip it out again and see what's really going on there. Will it blend? The first books written in the Bible were the letters of Paul, the ones that Paul actually wrote. He wrote first. We have very good reason to believe that Paul, whoever this guy was, and again, we'll get to that later on in the season, but that he wrote 1 Thessalonians, he wrote Galatians, he wrote the first letter to the Corinthians, he wrote a letter to Philemon, wrote the second letter to the Corinthians, he wrote Romans, and he wrote Philippians. That's it. All those other books that they claim Paul wrote, those were not written by Paul. We call that pseudographic. They are written by someone else who is using an intentional pseudonym of a real person to try to have the works attributed to that person. Those are the ones Paul wrote. And if you look at the time frame, that's when Paul was alive. Paul died, we believe, around 63, 64 BC, or CE, I apologize. We don't know exactly when. It's, one of those things that you think would be in the Bible, and then Paul died, never mentioned. Just like the story that Catholics love to talk about Peter being crucified upside down and they built a basilica on that spot. No. There's literally nothing in the Bible about that. Nothing. And we have the Flavian dynasty. I don't know how much you know about your Roman history, but Nero died in 69. The very beginning of 69 CE, Nero died. And he did not leave an heir. Some people think he was murdered, assassinated. Some people say he killed himself. That's not really... it's not really germane, but he was dead. The year of 69 was known as the year of the four emperors because three would-be emperors started off, didn't go well for them. They lasted just a couple months each. And then the Flavian dynasty began when Vespasian took control of Rome. That's really important to understand here, okay? Mark, James, Colossians, Matthew, Hebrews, John, Ephesians, Revelation, Luke, Acts, the first book of Peter, and Jude all were written during this about 30-year period. And if you're noticing something there, you should be. What should you be noticing? That the Gospels were written after Paul died. And that's really important to keep in mind. When you're reading Paul's letters, the way they're packaged in the New Testament for standard consumption, you would believe that Paul had read the Gospels and knew the words of Jesus and all that. He didn't, which is why he never quotes them. Paul never references anything that Jesus actually did in his life, nay, for a crucifixion, and he's real sparse on the details about it. He goes out of his way to tell us that he never met Jesus, didn't know anything about him until he was already dead. And Paul also goes out of his way to make sure you know that everything he's telling you came to him divinely through Jesus. This is not, you can't, Paul's a subscription only service. You can't get this anywhere else. And Paul was very adamant about that. Well, that makes a little more sense when you realize there was nothing to get anything from. Paul was making this shit up as he went along. I feel like that's really important to keep in mind. Then we get the Nerva dynasty. 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, Peter. Again, if you're keeping track, yes, that's a couple more letters that Paul supposedly wrote. Paul's been dead for going on 60 years when he supposedly wrote these letters, which would be a really impressive feat. Peter had long since been dead. He didn't write that. We don't even know who this John Cat was, but he was dead too. So again, none of these books were written by the guys that they tell you wrote them. That should really automatically set red flags off. That, like, can I trust what I'm reading here? Can this be trusted? But I feel like we have to go a little deeper here. We can't just... So we already know the timeline is bogus, right? The timeline already doesn't check out. He's, somehow Paul lived without any of these Gospels in his lifetime. Yet somehow, if you read the New Testament, you're told that Paul preached the gospel. How could he preach what didn't exist? Because Paul made up his own religion. And we're all rolling along with it. What we will really discuss this season in depth as well is who put Paul up to making up his own religion. That, I think, is the spicier question. So, we've used Riff's cock here to measure out that the story we have been told is not true. And as I alluded to, these books having, very interesting and dubious authorship, I feel like we should probably use another tool. Because you can't just use the Riff's cock system. You need to pair it up. And what better to pair the cock up with than Riff's ass? I'm talking about Riff's authorship scrutiny system. If you've got your cock and you've got your ass, you've got a party. That's all I'm saying. Shit Paul probably wrote. Thessalonians, Galatians, Corinthians. Philemon is a really interesting one. Philippians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. These are ones that we could definitely say Paul wrote. There's the language is there. They were written in the time frame that Paul was alive. There's a host of reasons to believe that Paul actually did write these ones. So great. Then we have shit Paul probably didn't write despite authorship claims. We've got Colossians, Ephesians, Second Thessalonians, First and Second Timothy, and Titus. The ones I've highlighted in blue are direct letters to specific people. The ones in black are Paul's letters to churches. And so I just wanted you to see that, Paul, we only know of one person Paul actually wrote a letter to. He wrote it to Philemon. We do not know who wrote the letters to Timothy and to Titus, pretending to be Paul. We also don't know if those people were even who those letters were written to, or if those people were also dead at this point, and the whole thing is a ruse. It seems more likely that those letters weren't even written to actual people. Wait till we get to Philemon, because I got some things to say about that. Paul should probably wish he didn't write that shit. Shit from unknown authors, Hebrews, and Revelation. Most people in the Christian church will tell you Paul wrote Hebrews. Those people are morons. Paul did not write Hebrews. One of the main ways you can tell whoever wrote Hebrews wasn't an idiot. Paul was not a learned man despite many of his claims to the contrary. His books are written in short, dumb guy sentences, and they're written in a very simple version of Koine Greek. Hebrews reads like it was written by somebody who actually was a scribe, someone who really knew how to write, and it flows with flavorful language. It's a very interesting book to read. It's batshit crazy, and it's all full of shit, but it was written by somebody competent. That's the first sign that Paul didn't write it. It was written by someone competent. And then there's pseudographic shit that isn't ascribed to Paul. The Catholic epistles, as we call them. We're talking about Mark, James, Matthew, John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Luke, Acts, 1st, 2nd, all of those. Those are ones that, while they didn't claim that Paul wrote them, we don't fucking know who wrote them. Because it wasn't any of those dudes. And so now you see, when you look at the ass, everything comes into focus. Use the ass along with the cock to truly take a look at the New Testament, because shit's not what it seems to be. That's what I'm trying to say. So, let's talk about Paul's guide to hijacking a religious movement. And to do that, I think we need to take just a second and understand the way things were at the time. So let's do that. You see, when Christ, again, we're going to accept, at least as for the argument that we're going to make, we'll accept as canon that Jesus was born, that part of the story holds true. That Jesus, died, he was crucified, and that there was a group of people that, worshipped him. We're willing to buy all of that. We'll sign off on that, okay? Let's sign off on that, just for argument's sake here. So the narrative is that he died, and immediately he starts being worshipped. And the Romans crack down on it, and Paul is beaten and imprisoned, and, he goes around seeding these churches, and eventually, for reasons that no Christian can explain, the Romans instead decide they're all in on Christianity, and after 200 years of beating the shit out of the Christians, they then adopt their faith, and it goes on to become the Holy Roman Empire, and the Roman Catholic Church becomes the most influential entity in existence for over 1,000 years. It's the narrative that we're told, right? It's a little more complicated than that. So, okay, again, for the purposes of our argument, we're going to say, okay, Jesus was born and he died. And, he said, if you remember, that he was coming back. And he also gave a time frame. He said that some of the people that were alive that day when he left to ascend into heaven, that they would still be here when he got back. And then when he got back, he was going to destroy the temple and create a new heaven on earth. That was his promise. So Jesus dies around 33 AD, CE, whichever one you want to use. So, he's dead. And the thing that I don't think people understand, and so let me try and really help push this narrative because it's important, is that there were lots of messiahs. Being a messiah was not like a new thing. It wasn't a particularly exciting thing. There were guys claiming to be the messiah every 15 minutes. It was constant. And the Romans, they didn't differentiate them because they didn't care. Because Messiah meant one thing if you were Rome. Messiah meant revolution. It meant people were going to create, this guy was going to lead an uprising against you. That's what Messiah meant if you were Roman. And if you were Jews, it meant, oh, this guy says, he's going to lead us to freedom. He's like the fourth guy today to say that, but sure, let's roll with it. Because this was really, really common. There could be multiple messiahs at once. So I think that's the first thing we need to do is just kind of put a little pin in this idea that Jesus claiming to be the Messiah was this big groundbreaking thing. No, that was just Tuesday. It was not a big deal. Then, if you take it a little further, you start to understand that the Romans, they were pretty tolerant of other religions. Rome didn't really care what you believed as long as you kept the peace. Rome was far more interested in everybody getting along. The only real bugaboo that the Romans had was that you had to acknowledge the emperor as a god. But because they were polytheistic, it wasn't a big deal. He's just another god. Well, this became a sticking point with the Jews because, of course, the Jews were one of the few monotheistic religions. And the Jews were adamant that they could not acknowledge Caesar as a god. Now, Christians have tried to frame that that is where the chaos between Romans and Christians came from. It's not. It's just not. The Romans actually didn't give a shit. And they made special compensations to the Jews that, hey, we get it. Your religion doesn't allow you to acknowledge him as a god. So then, how about you just pray to your God to bless Caesar? Basically, as long as you're willing to do that, we're good. And most of the Jews were able to get on board with that. Now, obviously, you have some that didn't like being under the thumb of Rome. And so they were not going to do that. And it began to create a religious fissure. And things began to separate. And the Jews, on some level, there was a whole bunch of levels as to how much they hated Rome. It did seem to correspond to how religious they were. The more religious, the less interested they were in Rome. And especially if you took the religion super seriously. We've talked about before Sadducees and Pharisees. There was more than just those two. There were also the Sicarii, who were as religious as it gets. They were assassins. They carried around knives and just flat out killed Romans. They sowed chaos. They believed that they were working towards creating this upheaval and that a Messiah would be born from the upheaval that they created. To your genuine Sadducees, who they didn't really like the Romans, but they were just interested in getting through the day and maintaining the wealth that they had amassed. Your Pharisees, they didn't like Rome. Some of them were willing to work with them on a certain level as long as Rome granted them enough autonomy. Others were more in the violent, we got to kill these guys and get them out of here. Things weren't good. So, right after Jesus has died, Caligula, you know the name, he comes on the throne in Rome. And at first, he kind of continues the pretty hands off approach to the Jews, and that works out well for everybody involved. Until he goes nuts. And one of the things that he decides to do when he loses his fucking mind is he says, we need to put a statue of me in the temple in Jerusalem. That, the mere thought of doing it went over about as well as you think it did. riots, assassinations. People are pissed. The governors there at the time are like, dude, we cannot do that. We've just got things under control here because the Herodian kings were no longer on the throne. Jerusalem was being administrated by Roman prefects, and for the most part, it was fairly docile. There was some, shit going on outside of Jerusalem, but it really wasn't that bad. There wasn't a whole lot of chaos yet. And then this asshole's like, hey, I need to put a statue of me in the, temple. He also levies a whole bunch of taxes on them because he's been spending money like a crazy person, and basically Rome is broke. But in order to not try to piss off the Roman populace, he decides to levy taxes on outlying communities of non Romans, the Jews being one of them. So now they're getting taxed. The guy's disrespecting their religion. It gives birth to the Zealot movement and the Sicarii and all of them, and they have basically decided they need a Messiah is coming. They cling to these messianic prophecies that a leader is going to come and unite them, and they're going to throw the Romans out of Jerusalem. And so now you've got a powder keg. And after Caligula, Tiberius, and other emperors, this continues to build and build. Until the time Paul starts writing his letters in the 50s, Jerusalem is a powder keg. It is very, very close to outright to outright war. And Nero, at this point, is doing everything he can to keep the fucking lid on this thing. And so Paul, see, all these Messianic Jews, they're the problem. Your regular Jews, your non-Messianic Jews, they don't really care. They're willing to work with Rome. They don't want a war. War's not good for anybody, right? Well, Paul just happens to come along and start preaching a little bit different twist on this. Paul takes that Messianic Judaism, that belief in a Messiah, and Paul goes, hey guys, what if the kingdom wasn't on earth? What if it was a spiritual afterlife kingdom? And by the way, Jesus showed up and told me we should totally get along with the Romans. In fact, they're our brothers and they can worship him too. Well, wouldn't that be convenient if that happened? Right at the time that, a powder keg was brewing and that the religious element of that powder keg was what was really going to light the fuse? Well, wouldn't it be convenient if a guy came along and was like, hey, I'm Jew and Roman, and the Messiah told me we should all get along? And that maybe he could just take the starch out of that religious movement and say, oh, yeah, no, Jesus was totally the guy, man. But he's not coming back like you think he is. He's totally not coming back to lead us in an uprising against Rome. He's coming back to take us to heaven. But until he gets back, we should totally get along with the Romans, pay our taxes, definitely not commit assassinations and, rioting. And we definitely shouldn't do that. Be awfully convenient, wouldn't it? Oops, not getting what I wanted. Give me 1 second. There we go. So Paul began his letter writing campaign. Jesus has been dead for at least 17 years. We're not sure exactly when Paul's letter writing campaign started, but Jesus has been dead about 17 years. Makes it very clear that he never met Jesus. Just this ghost Jesus who keeps telling him stuff that nobody else has ever been told before. Again, this should have been setting off, and maybe it did. Maybe there were plenty of people back then that this set off red flags for. But Christians, of course, they either don't know this or they don't want to know this. His message, you want to distill it down real quick. Paul says, you don't need the laws of Moses anymore. And any separatist tendencies that arise from observing those laws, Jesus totally said, don't do that. What am I talking about? Well, you see, Rome wanted everybody. Roman citizenship was something that Rome wanted everyone to aspire to. It wanted everyone to want to be a Roman citizen and to work towards that end. You were born a Roman citizen if your father was a Roman citizen, but just because you weren't born a Roman citizen didn't mean you couldn't obtain it. There were some things you had to do, some money had to be paid, but there were some benefits to being a Roman citizen. And so Rome was really big on selling that. Well, the problem for Jews was that a few of the things you had to do to be a Roman citizen, the law of Moses prevents you from doing. Mainly, you would have to acknowledge Caesar as a god or godlike. Book of Moses, obviously, Moses doesn't let you do that. And you can't keep kosher. Now, that one's a little tricky, so let me see if I can explain it. You see, part of being a Roman citizen was participating in communal observances. And so Rome had feasts all the time where the emperor and the rulers would give food to the public, and you were to gather as all the citizens in big public orgies and have these big feasts and hey, we're Roman citizens, we're all together, this is great. The Jews could not participate in those because the food, not that it, we understand what is kosher and what isn't as far as, you can't have a cheeseburger, for example, things like that. But it gets a little deeper because another thing that the Jews would not do was eat with Romans because Romans, you know, most people are familiar with the idea of praying over food before you eat it. Well, the Romans would take that food and they would show that food to an idol and offer it to the idol first. It was a ceremonial thing. Obviously, the stone image or whatever is not going to eat the food. But they would offer it. The food was offered to the gods, and then it was given to the people. Well, the Jews were like, yeah, you offered that food to idols. That's going to be a no for us. Big no, we can't eat that. So they couldn't acknowledge Caesar as a god, and they couldn't eat food with the Romans. Then they were still really big on the circumcision thing. Romans, not so much. The Romans found circumcision appalling, crude, and just generally despised it. The Jews were like, hey, this helps set us apart. It makes us different. And that is the core of Rome's issue. Rome wanted homogeny. Rome wanted everybody to want to be a Roman citizen, and they wanted being a Roman citizen to be a very specific thing. And the Jews were not on board with that, mainly because they said they couldn't be on board with it because of their religion. So, perfect timing for Paul to show up and go, hey guys, turns out all that stuff that keeps you from being a Roman citizen because, it's the law of Moses, Jesus said we don't need that anymore. Isn't it great? We can be Roman citizens. We can get down with these guys. In fact, Jesus says we're supposed to love them and that we should try to make them be like us. That we should totally all get along together. I mean, again, are you seeing a pattern here? Are we seeing a pattern? Paul repeatedly claims that all of his teachings come directly from God. He is super clear about that, repeatedly making sure that if somebody else tells you that they know where Paul got his info from, that they're wrong. He's the one that knows. God told him and only him. So you have to listen to him because this remarkable stuff that he's saying, he's the only dude. He did not read them off a gold plate like Joseph Smith. At least he never claimed he did. He got it ghost whispers. Paul was a ghost whisperer, apparently. He also gets really irate. He gets really irate at the idea that anyone but him can tell you how to develop the early church. He is adamant in his letters that nobody else knows that, he's the only one that knows this shit. And so you got to get the info from him. And again, right there, I want you to look at that for a second. Paul, in some of those late letters that actually weren't written by Paul, is telling people very specific church shit. Like, this is how you pick who is a deacon. This is how you pick who is your preacher. This is how you decide who can be an evangelist and who can't. All of this stuff. That if the church is supposedly this underground thing 20 years after Jesus died, why does it need all of this stuff to set it up? Like, again, Christians talk out of both sides of their face with this. That the church was this small underground thing. They were just meeting in people's homes, and it was, it was wildly growing, but it had to be completely on the underground. But also, Paul's got this super fucking specific list of ways you organize the church, which, for the record, are awfully similar to how Roman political organizations were organized. Just throwing it out there for you that there's some similarities. So, who were these early Christians? These people that Paul is writing to and talking to and trying to convince that they're doing it wrong. Well, there was the Christians under Peter, we all know who Peter is, and James, who was Jesus' brother, who had the badass moniker of James the Just. That's dope. That guy's pretty cool. We're going to stand him all season long. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah and that he would return to liberate them from oppression, literally. And they believe that following the laws of Moses in regards to a kosher diet and sexual morality are still required, at an absolute minimum. And they despise the Romans, and they openly dream of a day when they can throw those assholes out of Jerusalem. And now you see what I'm saying there with the kosher diet and whatnot. That happened during Paul's ministry. It's retold in the book of Acts, although the retelling is skeptical. There's a situation mentioned where Paul's been preaching and telling people, you don't got to listen to Moses, you don't have to do any of that shit. All you have to do is believe in Jesus. And some of the Jews are getting really pissed off, saying, this guy is teaching that, he's blaspheming against our laws. And so Paul gets called in. He goes to the temple. He meets with James and Peter, and they all come to an agreement that, okay, fine. You don't have to do offerings and all sacrifices and all that stuff, but you still got to keep kosher. And you still need to get circumcised, and you still, need to marry your wife, not just be philandering all over town. And we can all agree on that, right? And Paul agrees to it, and an edict is issued that states that. Of course, then Paul, in his later letters, tells people that he totally didn't agree to any of that shit, and that he bawled out Peter to his face and told him that he was being weak. Yeah, Peter and James were definitely gatekeepers. They believed that Christianity, as what they saw it was, a follower of Christ, was a Jew. They firmly believed that it was a Jewish religion and that it should stay a Jewish religion. Whereas Paul is desperate to turn this into an everybody gets to play religion. Paul's Christians, they believed that Jesus was the Son of God and that his liberation and ensuing kingdom were spiritual. Well, spiritual in nature. A little typo there for you. Believe that not only do the laws of Moses no longer apply, but that keeping them is to show disrespect to Jesus. They flat out believe that by keeping those, you're thumbing your nose at Christ. And they advocate for peace with and submission to the Romans. Now, if you're the Roman Empire, which one of those seems more palatable to you? Which one of those would you prefer to deal with and try to govern? Who do you think you would give a push to try to ensure that their version of this story is the one that everybody goes with? So let's look as we wrap up this week. What is in all these books? All these testaments, all the New Testament, what's in there? What are we going to dive into this year? This season? What are we going to find? Well, you get the story of Jesus. In Mark, it's a stripped down gospel intended to appeal to Romans through its use of magic and focus on Jesus' power. That was the first gospel written. And that's the big kicker there is, that's the one that we've talked about it doesn't really understand the details of Judea, and it was likely written by someone who never actually went there, because what they're doing now is, Jesus is this magically powerful guy. In Matthew, it's more, that book is definitely meant to more appeal to Jews. Jesus becomes a super rabbi, and Matthew loves to refer to how many of these old prophecies Jesus is fulfilling. Luke is intended to appeal to Greeks. It is written in a dramatic, poetic way, and it is the only one that claims to be a historical document, which would have endeared it more to Greeks. And then you get John. John is definitely intended to appeal to the people who have bought into what Paul is saying. And it definitively rejects all aspects of Judaism. It borders on flat out anti Semitism. John is the one that really leans into the narrative that Jesus was not a Jew. He was, throwing away what it meant to be a Jew, and that he was a Christian, that, he was the Christ and that you should follow him, and all that stuff in the Old Testament is not necessary. Which, again, is super convenient if you're the Romans. So then it's Jesus just left. He went back to heaven. Now what? Well, you get Acts. It's the quick recap of Jesus' ascension and then tale of the Jews' rejection of Christ. Paul's version of that story, mind you. And the decision to take Christ's message to the Gentiles. Acts basically shows us that once Jesus leaves, the Jews do nothing but harass his followers, and it is always the Romans that come to the rescue. I can't stress that enough. If you read the book of Acts, Paul and his buddy Barnabas and some of the other guys in those stories, they get the crap beat out of them repeatedly by the Jews. They get stoned, not in the fun way. They get, they have to be smuggled out of areas. They get jailed repeatedly, and it's always by the Jews. And the thing that saves them every time is Paul's Roman citizenship. The book of Acts, as much as anything, is an endorsement of how awesome it is to be a Roman citizen, because it'll protect you from those crazy Jews. Are you picking up on some undertones here? Then, the book of Romans. Paul recounts his conversion and really declares that he alone is empowered to steward the church. Then, you get Paul's letters to churches. 1 Thessalonians, he tells the church to hang in there, and then he takes a moment to remind them how awesome it was when he was there. It is about as masturbatory a book as you're going to read. He basically tells them, hey, being a Christian, it isn't always going to be easy. Sometimes people won't like you. Jews won't like you. And remember when I was there in Thessalonica? Man, was it awesome when I was there. You guys were so lucky to get to hear me preach, because Paul is a fucking wanker. Then in Galatians, he weighs in on the circumcision issue plaguing Gentile converts. What do I mean by that? Well, you see, according to James and Peter, anybody could become a Christian. But you still had to play along with the role with the Roman or with the laws of Moses. So if you wanted to be a Christian, you had to get circumcised and follow kosher dietary laws, as well as believe in Jesus. That is how you became, one of the group. That was the only way you could truly be a Christian in their eyes. They did have people that believed in Jesus but didn't want to get circumcised and all that. They considered them friendly, but not truly Christian. Paul, he weighs in and says, not only do you not need to get circumcised, but if you haven't been and you go do it, you're pissing in God's face. You shouldn't do it. You don't need to. That text, it's where that's really Paul's magnum opus of him stating that, Christianity is purely about believing in Christ and that's it, by faith alone. And that's all it is. That all this other stuff you don't need. The book of Galatians is probably one of the most important books in the New Testament for that reason, and I don't know that everybody actually knows that. In 1 Corinthians, we learn that the church in Corinth has a sexy time problem. We're not clued in to exactly what it is, but there's something going on in Corinth. And Paul wants them to know that he's heard about their sexy time problems, and they totally need to get that fixed. They need to make sure. See, one of the things you have to understand about Paul's philosophy on sex is that he flat out didn't want it to happen, ever. Paul was just such an asshole. But yeah, he thought that, really, do you ever need sex? You should just not have sex. How about that? That would be Paul's idea. Paul's like the anti-Mormon. Paul didn't think you needed to get married, you needed to do anything. Paul had a very priest-like idea of what religion should be. And oh, by the way, women should shut the fuck up. That is big time for Paul here. That he makes that very clear that there are women in the church at Corinth who are talking. He would prefer that they were not. Historically, we think that there's two kind of possibilities of what led Paul to get so huffy here. But there were a lot of the women in Corinth either were practitioners of older religions and like priestesses, things like that, and that Paul was, saying they're going to lead you astray because that's not Christianity, fuck them. Or that they could have just been women in the church who, because in other Roman religions, women were allowed to be priestesses and, they had equal access to the religion. They just assumed that, okay, this new Christian religion, well, we get equal access in that, right? And Paul said, no, you don't. Shut the fuck up. Philippians. Paul spends a lot of time talking about dongs and whether you should circumcise them or not. A lot of dong talk. Methinks Paul had a dong fascination. He also says thanks for the gifts and reminds the church that God loves it when people give him shit. And and he also makes it point out that he never asked for these gifts, but that you should totally keep sending him gifts because God loves it when you take care of his people. A lot of ministers today who are giant assholes and, have a small little church but a very big house and a very big car and nice suits and all that, they will claim that Paul is right here, Paul is right here saying that, well, this is where they will reach for this text a lot. Paul reminding you that it's your job to take care of the people that are doing God's work. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul defends his teachings. At this point, there had been some pushback. And a lot of people were like, Paul's version of this sounds way different than literally everybody else's. Paul is really into the Romans too. Should we trust this asshole? Paul defends his teachings and he lashes out at anybody who would doubt him, but then makes it a point to tell you that he's only calling you out because he loves you. And he also defends himself from any churches that all the stuff Paul was saying is because it benefits him. He also denounces that he's getting anything out of this, and also reminds everybody that he has divine authority to say what he says, and that everything he's saying is divinely inspired. Those are the books Paul actually wrote. So again, the guy was a bit of a dick. Then, someone pretending to be Paul wrote some letters to churches. In Colossians, atomism and philosophy had entered the minds of believers, who Paul had to snuff that shit out quickly, so he made a bunch of morality rules. So when you read the book of Colossians, and you're like, wow, Paul's really laying down the letter of the law here as to what is and is not immoral, that wasn't Paul. That was somebody who believed similarly to Paul and decided that Paul hadn't gone quite far enough in telling everyone how they were an asshole. So this guy steps in. We're calling him Who Paul because we don't know who. In the Ephesians, Who Paul speaks about how great it is to be a Paulian Christian and begs the Jews and Gentiles to get along for the good of the church. In Ephesus, shit was not going well. And the people who thought of the more Jamesian style of Christianity were really starting to put the boots to the Gentiles and be like, dude, if you're not going to get circumcised, if you're not going to keep kosher, you're not welcome here. You're at our church because you're not a Christian. And Paul steps in and is like, yo, everybody needs to get along. And by the way, it's really great to be like me. You should be like my team. We're better. In 2 Thessalonians, Who Paul implores the Christians to shame their fellow man who doesn't practice the faith as they do, but not as an adversary, as a brother. That's right, he outright advocates for cultural shaming of people who still choose to follow the Jewish way of thinking. Which again, if I'm Rome, I'm loving all of this, right? This is exactly what I need. Now, Paul wrote a letter to Philemon. If this doesn't tell you that Paul was an agent working for Rome, I don't know what will. The mental gymnastics that are about to be in this labor. Paul writes to Philemon. He's a wealthy leader at the church at Colossae. Paul requests that Philemon release from slavery a man who had fled his slavery to serve at Paul's side named Onesimus. That name is a pun. It means he is useful. Paul talks about slavery being a dehumanizing institution that Christians should not partake in. However, he is very careful in his letter to not condemn the practice outright, as that would have been an insurrectionist tendency, illustrated by the fact that he sends the runaway slave home. So, yes, if you're following here, Paul, a slave named Onesimus, runs away, and because he's a slave, and, being a slave sucks. So he runs away, he finds Paul, and he begins to minister with Paul and help Paul. He serves at Paul's side. He is useful to Paul. Paul says, I love you, man. I think you're great. But I have to uphold the institution of slavery, even though I'm totally not into it. So I'm going to send you back to your owner, Philemon. But I'm going to write a letter telling him that he should totally do the right thing and not necessarily free you, but he should send you back to me and I'll own you, but I'm way cooler than him, and then we can do our Christian thing up here. Again, Paul is a Roman. Yeah. Zale, you kind of nailed it there. But yeah, this is the mental gymnastics in Philemon that Paul goes are exactly what you would expect from a Russian operative. Or Russian. No, maybe he's a Russian operative too. From a Roman operative. That, hey, it's okay, and I get that our religion makes this slavery thing seem really bad, and it's okay to be opposed to it, but you still have to participate because it's the law. And the law, God has said, is super important. Not the law, the law of Moses. Not that law. The law of the Romans. Paul makes it very clear that the law of the Romans is the law you should be worried about. Then we get someone pretending to be Paul writing letters to someone pretending to be Paul's friend. In 1 Timothy, who Paul reminds Timothy that he needs to stay in Ephesus and make sure that everyone there only listens to Paul's teachings. He then states that no homo, women should still continue to shut the fuck up, and this is my favorite part, and that the only widows who are worthy of charity are the widows that are old, because they won't have sexual desire anymore. Because again, in Paul's world, when the husband dies, you shouldn't be getting remarried. You should just live a chaste life at that point. But because a younger woman whose husband dies might be encouraged to go get remarried or to, take on a boyfriend or something, Paul said no charity for them. Just for the old women that, Exactly. I don't think Paul understood what he was talking about. But yeah, really, again, weird book. In 2 Timothy, who Paul tells Timothy, I think I'm getting the axe, buddy. Things aren't going well here in Rome. But tells Timmy to do what Journey says and don't stop believing. He also implores that Timmy not be timid, but really go at anybody who is not Christianing in the Paul way. He's basically authorizing Timmy to be the punisher. And that if you're not going to Christian the right way, Timmy should bring the hammer down on you. Because Paul is gloriously going to his end. Even though, if you actually read the book of Acts and other things, you could notice that Paul weasels his way out of death numerous times. So for a guy that in this book talks so valiantly about going to his end, he sure did a lot to avoid it. In Titus, he implores him to stand up to anyone who's teaching that Judaism is still valid. He calls them false prophets and warns Titus that they are concerned with issues that do nothing to further Christ's and Paul's ministry. And he also mentions the Epimenides paradox, which I find at least interesting. If you're not familiar, that is the idea of the paradox. If I said, I'm a Roman and all Romans are liars, well then did I just lie, or where's the lie? It's that kind of paradox. Paul mentions that, basically saying that how can you observe the laws of Moses and the laws of Jesus, because the laws of Jesus invalidate the laws of Moses, so the laws of Moses aren't valid, so you shouldn't worry about them. It's, again, Paul didn't write that. It's way too well written to have been written by Paul. Then we get the book of Hebrews. One of the more important books in the New Testament. It is anonymous. It says right in it, we don't know. The author of the book never says his name. Christians, because it's such an intelligent defense of Paulian Christianity, Christians just assume that Paul wrote it, and they also like to tell you that Paul wrote it because that gives it far heavier weight than just saying some guy that believed Paul wrote this defense of Paul's theological thought, and oh, by the way, he did a way better job of it than Paul ever did. It was possibly written by Apollos. He was a colleague of Paul's he's mentioned in the Bible twice. Both times they mention how well spoken he was. So the way the book of Hebrews has got a very poetic bent to it, it could have very possibly been written by this guy Apollos, who wouldn't put his name on it because, well, he's named after a Greek god that, immediately would have had some Christians be dismissive of it. So instead he put, people kind of ascribed it to Paul. Although we must point out, Apollos didn't do that. Modern day Christians did that. Again, the book of Hebrews makes no claim on authorship. It fleshes out the idea that Paul had been hinting at into the full-blown doctrine of supersessionism. Supersessionism is the belief that Jesus completely invalidated all of the Old Testament laws. That anything that was required for religious practice by the Jews is now gone. That Jesus had, made all that irrelevant. All you had to do is believe in Jesus now. It's the link that Hebrews is where they really drive it home. Like, no, this is the same God. The God that wanted you to do all this shit before, he's changed his mind. Now just do it this way. But it's totally the same guy. Not a different guy. Same guy. And also, he really does work to keep people believing in Jesus. Because, again, Jesus, again, when he left, we're supposed to believe around 30 to 33 CE, he said, some of you will still be alive when I come back. And now it's been 30 some odd years since he's been gone. Um, where's he at? You know? And so Hebrews wants to remind you to keep waiting. And this text is super susceptible to interpretation. Some people read it and they say, this guy is sympathetic to the Jews, basically saying, I know it's hard to get rid of your old tendencies, but you really don't need those anymore. Others, people have looked at it that flat out, the Jews are no longer the chosen people, Christians are the chosen people. That is really not a popular belief for Jewish people. That you basically have taken their right as God's chosen people and we're like, nope, anybody can be that now. You don't have to be a Jew. You can just do it like us. And now we have the impostles. We have James. James who? It wasn't James, Jesus' brother. He was dead long before this was written. But whoever he is, he retorts Paul with subtle grace. And Catholics and Protestants will spend the rest of existence fighting over this letter. That is not an exaggeration. Catholics read the letter of James and they say, see, this is where the whole idea of confession and everything exists. Because James hints at the fact that works alone are not enough. Or that faith alone is not enough to get you into heaven. That your faith will lead to works. And so if you truly believe, you will be keeping these covenants, which kind of, would play back to what we thought about James earlier, that James wanted Christianity to still be a Jewish religion. Protestants read that text and say, no, what he's saying is that if you really are a Christian, your behavior will change. He's not saying that you have to do good works. He's saying that you will do good works because of the change. And that, so you get Protestants who believe faith alone. They claim that James is telling them that. You get Catholics who believe it's faith and works, and they also claim James is telling you that. So, thanks for all the fighting for years, Dick. 1 Peter. Peter was way dead by the time this was written. It's an ode to persevering in the face of persecution, which there really wasn't any persecution back then, so I don't know what he was persevering in the face of. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, we got John Doe here. He declares Christ flesh, calls out anybody who says he wasn't, and tells people to keep the faith, warns against false teacher, and really just it's like a Greek logic poem is what John's letters really are. He basically just argues that Jesus became man and that it was God becoming man. That is where up until these letters came out, that wasn't really how people looked at it. Messiahs were people. They weren't God. They were they were touched by God. They were empowered by God. Nope, John was like, no, Jesus was God. And you guys need to get in line with that. And then Jude was possibly written by a guy named Jude. Maybe. We don't really know. He fiercely warns against anyone who doesn't follow the church's law. Which church and what law are a bit ambiguous. We are not really sure what he's talking about. He just keeps referring to this church and how you totally better get on board with it. There's lots of Old Testament space dragon analogies in that one, so it's kind of a fun read. It's a short book, but yeah, he again tries to tie Christianity to Judaism, but still make the point that it's outdated now. Follow the church. You don't need to listen to the laws of the Old Testament. Follow the church. And 2 Peter, which is possibly just a remix of Jude. There's a lot of scholars that think 2 Peter was literally cribbed from Jude, and they rewrote it and ascribed it to being a Peter. And it basically says if somebody worships God differently than you, don't trust them. So in summation, we have 7 books that that were likely written by Paul between 50 and 60 CE. One anonymous Pauline manifesto, that would be Hebrews, written somewhere after Paul died. Two Gospels that were written after Paul's death, 70 to 80 CE, right as Vespasian took control of Rome. I keep hinting at that because it's really important. One Gospel and one history, air quotes there, that were written by someone later on, 85 to 90. That would be Luke and Acts. And then one Gospel with a way different tone, that one came way after the fact. Then you get one anonymous batshit apocalypse, that would be the book of Revelation. 6 books that are attributed to Paul that are written, as you remember, Paul died in 63 or right around there. 7 letters that were written long after the eponymous authors died. That's what we've got. So, as you can see, Paul came up with this religion. And then everybody wrote a story around it to make Paul's religion seem legit. You don't have to be a genius to see what was going on there. So I know we've gone long today. I will wrap this up. But basically, what we're going to surmise this season is that Paul was an agent of Rome working to help quell the differences between the Jews and Christians. When the Great Fire in Rome happened, it was likely set by Christians. But you need to understand what that word meant to Romans. That does not mean followers of Jesus. They basically meant any Messianic Jews. So separatist Messianic Jews likely did start the Great Fire of Rome. And so Nero persecuted them. Not because they believed in Jesus, but because they were religious separatists. That's probably why Paul got executed, is that he was like, you know what, guy, my little psyop here isn't working. We're not able to convince them to join up with us. So then, the Great Jewish War happens 3 years later, starts in 66. Chaos goes on. In 69, that's how Vespasian takes control of the Roman Empire, as he crushes the Jewish revolt. He goes back in 69, leaves his son to mop it up. His son mops up things, and it parades in, destroys the temple, just like Jesus said. The Gospels were written under direct authorization from Vespasian and the Romans around him in order to declare himself a Messiah, basically saying that Vespasian was fulfilling Jesus' prophecy to come and liberate the Jews. He was liberating them from the hang-ups of their religion. And he used the baseline set by Paul to build this religion around, to unite the Holy Land. And it caught on so well that they united the entire empire under this religion that they made up completely to control a political uprising. Next week, we will focus on Paul. We will get into who Paul was, and it becomes very obvious, very quick, that he was a James Bond level spy whose job was to disrupt the Jewish resistance, and he did a really good job at doing that. Thank you so much for being here this week. Welcome back. I hope season 4 is as exciting for you as it is for me to get to tell you all about it. I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday. Thank you so much for being here. Take care, and we will be back next week. We were going to learn all about Paul. And if you think he's a dick now, just wait. I will leave you with this. This is my favorite little thing. Many Christians love to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, Paul was mentioned. That's where we get the name James the Just, and we know that James was known as James the Just. Do you know what they called Paul? He was known as Paul the Liar. You can look it up. I want you to keep that in mind when we dive into Paul next week. Thanks for being here, everybody. Have a Sunday. Praise Ray.